Mm. There's nothing like the aroma of freshly baked bread. And with your Black & Decker all-in-one Pro automatic bread maker, you and your family can have the old-fashioned goodness of home-baked bread the convenient way, because your new all-in-one Pro bread maker does all the work for you, automatically. All you have to do to make bread is add ingredients. Everything else is up to your bread maker. Mixing, kneading, and baking the bread for you. Sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? Well, it is. But before we get to the fun part, baking your own bread, I want to remind you that you should read your all-in-one Pro operating instructions and cookbook carefully before attempting to operate your bread maker. This video is going to show you the different parts of your bread maker, how to measure ingredients and put them in your bread maker, and how to program your bread maker to start baking right away, or delaying baking so you can have a fresh loaf in the morning. We'll also look at the different kinds of breads you can make and how to correct your mistakes if your bread doesn't come out right. First of all, let's take a look at your all-in-one Pro bread maker. Basically, we have two essential parts. The baking pan, where you place your ingredients. This fits into the bread maker like this. And the control panel. This is where you set the bread maker for different kinds of bread and colors of crust, as well as different programs that let you control the timing of the rise and baking cycles. If you like, you can watch your bread maker in action through this viewing window on top. But please resist the temptation of opening the lid during the baking cycle, because it could affect baking results. Next, we're going to look at how ingredients are measured and placed in your baking pan, and how to begin the actual baking process. As you know, your all-in-one Pro bread maker will make both 1.5 pound and 2 pound loaves of bread. Your recipe booklet has separate recipes for each loaf size. Please make sure you use the correct recipe for the size of loaf you wish to bake. And speaking of recipes, you might have noticed that your booklet has 2 recipes for each loaf size, one for the U.S. and one for Canada. If you live in the U.S., please make sure you use the American recipe. And if you live in Canada, please follow the Canadian recipe. Following the correct recipe, using recommended ingredients, measuring them accurately, and adding them in the order listed is very important, because bread making is like a science, and its success depends on a precise amount of ingredients working off one another in an exact way. Substituting ingredients, using the wrong ingredients, or measuring inaccurately will throw off the whole process of automatic bread making. We've developed and tested all our recipes using national brands of flour. In Canada, we found that most all-purpose and national brands of bread flour will work well in your bread maker. However, in the U.S., you must use bread flour because American all-purpose flour will produce poor results and therefore should not be used in your bread maker. And never use fast-rising, pastry, or cake flour in the recipes for either country. All the recipes in your booklet have been developed using Fleischmann's bread machine yeast. However, you may use traditional, quick-rising, or fast-rising active dry yeast with acceptable results. But please refer to your operating instructions and cookbook for adjustments when using different dry yeasts. You cannot use fresh yeast in your bread maker, nor should you combine different kinds of dry yeast. After opening your yeast, store it according to the manufacturer's instructions, and always check the expiry date. All right, now we're ready to bake our first loaf of fresh, home-baked bread. Now, since your bread maker comes with the baking pan inside the unit, I want to show you how to take it out, which we recommend you do before adding ingredients to avoid spills inside the baking chamber. Just grasp the handle like this, twist in a counterclockwise direction, lining up the notch on the pan with the unlock arrow, and pull the baking pan straight up. Now, insert the mixing paddle by lining up the flat side of the paddle with the flat side of the shaft in the baking pan, and then slide the paddle onto the shaft, like this. Once the mixing paddle's in place, you're ready to add the ingredients. And today I'm going to show you how to make a 2-pound loaf of basic white bread that's listed in the operating instructions and cookbook. For my 2-pound loaf of bread, I'm using 1.5 cups of water at room temperature. That's about 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. The temperature of the liquid is very important because if it's too cold, it won't activate the yeast. If it's too hot, it'll kill the yeast. For measuring water or milk, you'll need a standard clear liquid measuring cup, so you can check the measure at eye level to make sure it's accurate. Too much or too little liquid will affect the quality of your bread, and that's a little too much. Perfect. Next, I'll add the other ingredients using standard measuring spoons. Each ingredient should be leveled off with the straight edge of a knife or a metal spatula. First, I add 2 tablespoons of powdered milk. Then 2 tablespoons of shortening, or if you prefer, you can use butter or margarine. Next, a tablespoon of sugar. 1½ teaspoon of salt, which I've also leveled off. Now I add the flour. To measure flour, use standard dry measuring cups and make sure you use the appropriate size cup for each measure. Then gently spoon the flour into the cup and level it off. The final ingredient is 1¼ teaspoon of dry yeast, which you always add last. Make sure the yeast doesn't touch any of the liquid ingredients, especially if you're using the timer, because the liquid could activate the yeast too soon. And now we're ready for the all-in-one Pro Bread Maker to do the rest of the work for us. To insert the baking pan, lower it into the oven with the handle like this until the pan fits over the mechanism at the bottom and is in a diagonal position. Now gently twist it clockwise until it locks. Fold the handle down, close the lid, and you're ready to select your setting. When you plug in your bread maker, you'll see these 2 arrows in the display window which are automatically set for basic bread and a regular crust. You'll also see 12 a.m. flashing on this digital clock. You don't have to set the clock if you want to bake your bread right away. All you have to do is select the appropriate setting and push the Start Reset button. On the control panel, there are 4 bread settings, a dough pasta setting, and a crust selection setting for regular or dark crust. The basic bread setting that you're looking at now is for breads that have white flour as the main ingredient. To move the arrow to the other selections, press the Bread Type button. The next selection is Rapid Bake, the shortest cycle. It's used when you want to make basic bread more quickly than you can with the normal basic cycle. The Rapid Bake program works for a variety of basic breads which are indicated in your recipe booklet. Please do not use it for other types of bread because it will not work successfully. The sweet setting is for breads with large amounts of sugar or sweet ingredients, such as raisins, chocolate, or dried fruit. The sweet setting and all the other settings except for Rapid Bake has an add ingredient signal that sounds like this and tells you when to add ingredients like nuts, dried fruit, seeds, or raisins. Whole grain is for recipes with significant amounts of whole wheat or rye flour, oats, or bran. It's the longest program because the heavier, denser flours require more rising time than white flour. The last setting is for dough, which you shape and then bake in a traditional oven. You can make pizza crust, rolls, pretzels, and lots of other delicious recipes featured in our booklet. And you can also make pasta dough, but you must use special pasta flour called semolina and process the dough with a pasta maker or shaper. The crust color setting is used for the basic, rapid bake, and sweet cycles only. It will not work for whole grain or dough settings. To choose the type of crust you want, select the appropriate setting and then press the crust color pad to select regular or dark. Your new all-in-one Pro Bread Maker is equipped with the OptiRise function, which allows you to extend the rise time of your dough. 5 minutes before the bake cycle begins, you'll hear 12 beeps and the first OptiRise light will flash. You now have the option of adding 10 more minutes to the rising cycle. If you want to add a further 10 minutes to the rising cycle, you can do this 2 minutes before the end of the first OptiRise cycle. You'll find further details on how OptiRise works on page 11 of your instruction and cookbook. Please read them carefully. Remember that the OptiRise feature only works for a 2-pound loaf recipe. You cannot use it with the dough pasta setting or for a 1.5-pound loaf of bread. As we said at the start, your all-in-one Pro Bread Maker gives you 2 options to choose when you want your bread to be baked. Say you want to delay baking so you can come home to or wake up to a loaf of freshly baked bread. Well, that's easy using the timer, which can be set for up to 13 hours. Or you can start baking your bread right away. First, we'll learn how to use the timer for delayed baking. For example, say it's 9:30 at night and I want to have a fresh loaf of this basic white bread at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Before I can use the timer, I have to set the clock for the correct time of day, which, as we said, is 9:30. Here's how we do it. First, press the clock button, and while the 12 is flashing, press the down arrow until the display reaches 9, making sure the AM or PM is correct. Then press the clock button again to set the minutes. Press the up or down arrow until the 30 appears. If you want to change the minutes more quickly, you can hold down the arrow like this, and the minutes will change in 5-minute intervals. If the hour setting has stopped flashing before you get a chance to set the minutes, like this, then press the clock button twice, and while the 2 zeros are flashing, press the down or up arrow to set the minutes. Okay, we've set the correct time of day at 9:30 p.m. Now let's set the time when we want our bread to be ready, which is 8 tomorrow morning. This is done very much like setting the clock. First, press and hold down the timer button for a few seconds until 12 a.m. reappears along with the word timer. And while the 12 is flashing, press the up or down arrow until the display reaches 8. Check that it says AM instead of PM. Now, because the display already reads 8 a.m., I don't have to set the minutes. I simply wait for the 8 to stop flashing, and then I double check my bread setting, which in this case is a basic bread with a regular crust. When I start the delayed baking function by pressing the timer button, you'll see the completion time flash briefly before the current time is displayed. So I press the timer. There, you saw the completion time, 8 a.m., and now the current time. You'll also notice the green light has come on, indicating that the timer has been set. If the green light doesn't come on, you'll hear a long beep indicating you've made a timer error. If the display reads 13-hour timer error, you've set the timer for more than the maximum 13-hour delay. If the display reads 0-hour timer error, like this, you've set a time that's shorter than the bread making cycle. If either of these two error displays appear, you must simply reset the timer. You cannot use the timer if you're using the rapid bake setting, and if your recipe calls for perishable ingredients such as fresh milk, eggs, or cheese, you should never delay baking because your ingredients could spoil before the baking process begins. Now, let's look at our second option, how to start baking your bread right away. Since we've already programmed the bread maker for delayed bake, we first have to clear the programming. To do this, simply press the timer button till the green light goes off. This will cancel the delayed bake program. Then check your bread type setting, basic bread with regular crust. Now press the Start Reset button and the red light comes on to indicate the cycle has begun. At the same time as the red light comes on, the window will display the cycle time for the type of bread you're making, which in this case is 3 hours and 50 minutes for our basic bread. Your bread maker automatically goes into a preheat cycle to ensure the ingredients are at the right temperature. The time remaining until your bread cycle is completed is counted down in minutes in the display window. Now, different people prefer different kinds of breads, and different kinds of bread have different heights and texture characteristics. So what you might consider imperfect might not be imperfect at all. Generally, breads such as pumpernickel, rye, and whole wheat breads are shorter and denser, while white breads usually are lighter and fluffier. But sometimes, even though you think you've done everything right, your bread just doesn't turn out properly. So while we're waiting for our bread to bake, let's take a look at some of the problems you might encounter. Remember, almost all bread that is short or sunken is a result of using the wrong ingredients, forgetting ingredients, or measuring inaccurately. For instance, if your bread comes out like this one, cratered with the tops or sides caved in, you may have used too much liquid or forgotten the salt. If it turns out gnarly and knotted on top or hasn't risen enough, chances are you haven't used enough liquid or you've put in too much flour. A poor rise could also be the result of too much salt. Think about whether you used a tablespoon instead of a teaspoon. Remember, salt, like yeast, is always measured in teaspoons, not tablespoons. Which brings us to these mushroom-shaped loaves, which have risen too much. They could be the result of too much yeast or sugar, or not enough salt. And what about when your bread comes out looking like a rock? Well, most likely you've forgotten the yeast or you've used some that's old. Check the expiry date. For more details about yeast, flour, and other ingredients, please refer to the ingredients section of your recipe booklet. For more information about bread that doesn't turn out successfully, please look in the tips section. Oh, great. That's the signal that tells us our bread is ready. Now, I'm going to take my bread out right away, but with the keep warm function, you can leave your bread in the bread maker for up to an hour. This blinking red light indicates the keep warm function is in operation for 60 minutes. After that time, the light will stop blinking, indicating the keep warm period is over. But the light will remain on until you unplug or reset your unit. Once the light has stopped blinking, try and remove your bread as quickly as possible, within 10 or 15 minutes, to prevent it from becoming soggy. And you should always wear oven mitts when taking your bread out of the oven, because the bread pan is very hot. To remove the bread, turn the pan upside down and gently shake the bread loose onto a cooling rack. You should always check to make sure the mixing paddle's in the baking pan and not in your bread, because you could damage the blade if you cut into it. If the mixing paddle is in the bread, let it cool, then remove it, and always wash it as soon as possible after each use. Oh, that smells delicious. But remember, you have to let your bread cool for the recommended 15 to 30 minutes so it slices easily. And now for the best part of baking your own bread. And this is only the beginning, because the kinds of breads and doughs you can make with your new Black & Decker All-in-One Pro Breadmaker are practically endless. Everything from rye, pumpernickel, raspberry braid and challah breads, to English muffins, dinner rolls, and your favorite pastas. So have fun and experiment a little after you've tried some more basic recipes. For care and cleaning of your All-in-One Pro Automatic Bread Maker, please refer to your operating instructions booklet. If you have any other questions, please call 1-800-231-9786 in the U.S. and in Canada, call 1-800-465-6070.